Welcome back to the Horsemanship Breakthroughs podcast. Thanks for being here. I'm Amalia Dempsey, and in today's episode, I interview Shelby Dennis on horse welfare, advocacy, ethics, and industry change. You may know Shelby as Milestone Equestrian or SD Equus on social media, and she is known for her advocacy work, spreading awareness and uncovering the truth of what happens behind the scenes in the horse industry with the hope to stop abusive practices and improve horse welfare. Shelby is a 29-year-old professional horse trainer and behavior consultant based in the Fraser Valley of British Columbia. Shelby has over 24 years of experience with horses, from the Arabian horse circuit to hunter jumper to dressage and exercising racehorses. Shelby's practical experience with different kinds of horses has made her a well-rounded horse person. On top of her practical experience, Shelby has also taken her post-secondary studies seriously, taking several equine science-based courses to work towards her Certificate of Equine Science, choosing to emphasize her studies and education on equine behavior. In early 2021, Shelby received her Equine Behavior Consultant certification from the International Association of Animal Behavior Consultants. The understanding and correct application of equine learning theory has allowed Shelby to hone her skills as a horse person and continue modernizing her approach as a trainer with emphasis on equine ethology and ethical practice. Shelby attributes her history with horses to shaping the hardworking, patient, and driven individual she is today. Throughout her years as an equestrian, Shelby has witnessed a variety of training techniques and different mindsets in the professionals that she has worked with. As she has grown up in the horse world, studied equine science, and developed a better understanding of the psychological and biological mechanics of the horse, her personal vision has been shaped with the knowledge of horses as honest, kind, and forgiving creatures. Shelby's philosophy is founded on the premise that patience, understanding, and consistency will breed happy equine partners with a better work ethic and a more willing attitude. There is no one way when training horses, and with this in mind, Shelby's intent is to design individual training programs using methods that best fit the individual horse while keeping in mind their similarities in behavior and learning theory as a species. Using positive reinforcement with a mixture of traditional methods, Shelby works at a pace suited to the individual horse. With her experience working with neglected and abused horses along with many different breeds, she is comfortable handling a variety of horses coming from all walks of life. Shelby firmly believes that good handling starts with providing horses with ample turnout and the ability to express their natural behaviours. Because of this, she is an advocate for educating people on the benefits of adequate turnout and social turnout with other horses. She has noticed huge changes in her own horse's demeanour since moving from traditional stall/small paddock boarding to 24/7 outdoor field board. While this exact setup may not work for all horses, Shelby does believe that allowing horses the opportunity to socialise and move about without being confined to small areas for extended periods of time will only create happier and more adaptable horses in training, and prioritises this in her program. Shelby is also the host of the Making Milestones podcast and a newly released show titled Main Character Energy. This interview is an eye-opening, confronting, and thought-provoking conversation where we discuss many of the difficult conversations around welfare, abuse, and ethics in the horse industry. I have so much admiration for Shelby and the incredible work that she does in advocating for horse welfare. Her bravery in speaking out, even in the face of backlash, is truly inspiring. She is not only well-spoken, but also deeply knowledgeable, bringing important conversations to light that many shy away from. While calling out abuse and ethical concerns in the horse world is uncomfortable for most, Shelby does it with unwavering dedication, pushing for the change that horses so desperately need. Thanks to advocates like her, we're finally seeing some progress, like snaffles and bitless bridles being legalised in high-level competition. The industry honestly needs more people like Shelby, and I'm really grateful for the work that she's doing. In this episode, Shelby and I discuss what sparked Shelby's passion for horse welfare and the personal experiences that led her to advocate for change, how Shelby's training has evolved over the years from punishment-based to reward-based, The biggest welfare concerns in the industry, including harsh training methods, equipment, poor management, and a widespread lack of ability to read and understand horse behavior. The change in her own horse that made Shelby start questioning traditional methods of keeping and training. The challenges of holding top riders accountable whilst leaving the door open for change. Social media as both a tool for change and a platform for cancel culture and where the line is. The persistence of abuse at the top levels of competition despite increased exposure. Corruption in the horse world. A vision for what the horse world could look like in an ideal scenario. Realistic changes that could actually happen in the horse industry, and the first 3 things that Shelby would overhaul if she had the power. The possibility of horses truly enjoying being ridden and competing. Ethical concerns beyond competition, recognising that not all horsemanship trainers or styles are ethical and how to differentiate. 2 trainers setting a better example in horse sports. The use of positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement, and whether pure negative reinforcement can be used ethically. The backlash that comes with calling out unethical practices and how Shelby handles it. Debunking the notion that if the horse didn't want to, they wouldn't, and how this idea is used to justify abuse. What keeps Shelby motivated to continue pushing for change. Common misconceptions about Shelby's advocacy work. Shelby's personal goals with horses and training, her favourite horse books and resources, and what she's currently learning about, plus so much more. Let's dive into the episode. Welcome to the Horsemanship Breakthroughs podcast. I'm your host, Amalia Dempsey. If you believe in kind horsemanship, a holistic approach to horse care and training, and a world where both horse and rider thrive and enjoy the journey, you're in the right place. Here I share insights from my own horsemanship journey and the wisdom of horse people from around the world to improve horse and human relationships, promote ethical training practices, and build deeper connections with our horses. Together, we explore training methods with an open mind, always striving to do what's best for the horse. This podcast is about lifelong learning, questioning the norm, and embracing the journey of growing alongside our horses. Be sure to follow the show so you never miss an episode, and visit amaliadempsey.com for more resources to elevate your riding and horsemanship. I hope you enjoyed today's show. Welcome Shelby Dennis from Milestone Equestrian to the Horsemanship Breakthroughs podcast. I'm excited for our chat today. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me on. I'm excited to be here and looking forward to talking to you.
Now, you are a standout individual in the horse welfare space on social media. Can you tell us what sparked your passion for advocating for animal welfare in the horse industry?
There's a couple of different things that did. I think one of the biggest things that has made me really involved in it is that I grew up in the show world, and I grew up being taught to do things to horses that I later learned were really unfair when I started to study horse behavior and just reflected more on the things that I did. And on top of that, I'm also neurodivergent. So I grew up in a space where I wasn't always having my feelings honored, and where I felt pressured to do things that I didn't want to do, and where I had to feel like I had to fit into a certain box in order to be accepted. So in a way, I resonate a lot with some of the welfare struggles that horses face, because they aren't often allowed to exist as they are meant to as a species in the way that's most authentic and healthiest for them. So I want to use my voice to advocate for change based off of what I have learned and having come from a space where I was taught to mishandle horses, because it painted a very clear before and after picture just from my own anecdotal experience based off of how I used to handle horses versus how I handle them now, and the changes that I've seen positively in both the horses and myself. And it's kind of snowballed from there. The more I've gotten into it and the more I've studied horses, just the more committed I've become to the cause.
Amazing. And I think many of us can relate to that, because so much of what we're taught as kids growing up with horses, later we realize, oh, that's probably not the best thing for the horse. What would you say are the main differences compared to what you were taught versus how you train now?
I grew up showing Arabian horses on the breed circuit. So most of the horses in that circuit, at least where I live, a lot of them are stalled and they're kept in individual turnout, if they are turned out because they can't really afford, or so they say, they can't afford to have them marked up and be looking unsightly for shows. There was also a lot of harshness in terms of the types of equipment that was used, draw reins, twisted wire bits, and lots of punishment, like physical punishment, like smacking the horses for things or whipping them, or excessive use of spurs, or things that are still physical punishment but not perceived in the same way by a lot of people, like shanking the horses, waving ropes at them, chasing them around, running them backwards and whatnot, and just an awful lot of impatience where I was taught that the only means of dealing with unwanted behavior was through punishment, and I didn't really learn how to properly train as a result. Whereas now I've realized that punishment has a lot of shortcomings and it's not the most effective means of dealing with unwanted behavior because it fails to acknowledge what the cause of the unwanted behavior is. So now I use rewards-based methods and I really try to prioritize rewarding the behaviors that I want to see and focusing on what is desired rather than focusing on what I don't want to see and trying to suppress those behaviors, because whenever I see an unwanted behavior, I know there's a reason behind it, and it's far more effective to address the reason rather than trying to just suppress the behavior.
Just because some of us horsemanshipy type people can tend to live under a rock when it comes to the rest of the horse world, can you tell us what are the main horse welfare concerns in the horse industry today?
In my opinion, I would say a huge one would be stalling practices. A lot of people view stalls as like a necessary component of horse care, and they think that horses need a stall, when in reality, horses just need access to shelter. And as a species, they're really not meant to be standing still for extended periods of time. So I would say that's one of the most pressing welfare issues is how horses are kept on the day-to-day basis, because far too many boarding facilities do not have adequate turnout for horses. And then they also, on top of that, feed small grain meals of like just a flake or so each day, or like each feeding. And then the horses are going hours and hours without grazing on top of standing around in unnatural positions all day. Because if you watch horses in a natural environment where they're allowed to be able to access forage opportunities and be out with other horses and the space to move around, a lot of their time is just spent moving and foraging for food. And when we don't allow them those opportunities, we see a ton of stress behaviors develop. So a lot of the problems that people then justify unethical training practices under saddle to deal with are influenced by the horse's management situation. And if we address the management situation, people would feel less of a need to use harsh equipment in order to control horses.
That makes a lot of sense. And you'd be happy to know that I actually don't even have any stables at home. I think that would be great to have, certain situations like injuries and whatnot. But
Yeah,
my horses live a pretty happy life, I would say.
that's fantastic.
Yeah, it's good. And I think a lot of people that listen to this podcast are pretty on board with like the 3 Fs and providing that kind of lifestyle, a natural lifestyle for the horse as much as possible. Are there any other sort of horse welfare concerns in the horse industry that you like to bring to people's attention aside from that?
For sure. Yeah, I do also find that there is a big lack of understanding of what normal horse behavior even looks like, because so many people are exposed to stress behavior on a constant basis. So then when we go and we look at competition and how horses behave in competition, there is a misreading of why the horse is behaving a certain way. People will see horses having outbursts of like bucking, rearing, bolting, or running at fences where they're trying to run through the bridle and they have their head in the air, and they're just trying to blow through the rider's aids. And people will say that they're excited and they love their jobs and that these are high-end sport horses and these are what the horses are like. But really what we're seeing is that these horses have shared traumas where their living situations are typically relatively similar, or they have similar trauma pertaining to how they're trained and stress of the show environment. And then we see it all kind of come to an explosive head in the show atmosphere where they're no longer coping, and then those behaviors come out. So the lack of ability to read horse behavior from the perspective of the horse contributes to a lot of mistreatment in the horse world because we're just not understanding them on such a fundamental basis, and we're not understanding how flight animals function as energy conservers and that they don't run around just wasting energy for no purpose. While they do play and they will engage in play behaviors that sometimes look similar to the stress behaviors we see in the show ring, when you're watching them side by side or from a more nuanced lens, once you're around horses who are living in a more natural lifestyle with lower stress, it becomes very clear that the level of explosives that we see at the pinnacle of horse sports aren't play behaviors, and the degree to which that we see them is also a big problem. It also concerns me for the people because there's so many incidents that I see online or in the media from competition where horses or people are put in really dangerous situations because of how the horses are reacting to stress, and riders are injured or killed, or horses are injured or killed. And in my opinion, so much of that is very avoidable if we just address the stress epidemic in the horse world and start to look at horses through the lens of how they're supposed to function as a species rather than through the human lens of how we think they're supposed to function as a species. Because what we feel about the behavior often comes from a biased lens. And I speak as someone who used to do that a lot, where I would view stress behavior as excitement or horses trying to be intentionally bad. And I would put a human centric lens on it because that's all I was taught to do. And the first part of undoing that habit is admitting that there is a bias in the first place. So I think it's important for people to recognize that even when you're actively trying to learn more, there can still be an element of bias, and we need to be conscious of that so that we don't fall into the trap of labeling behavior of our horses through the lens that we see it through rather than through what the horse is most likely feeling.
Yes, absolutely. And to be honest, I'm surprised that more people aren't injured on a regular basis, given people's overall lack of ability to read the horse and what they might be feeling. And yeah, I do think we are kind of brainwashed to some extent, depending on our education growing up with horses, on what they are feeling through like anthropomorphism and just our own, our own human interpretation of what we think is going on. It seems to be this isn't just at grassroots, like you see it at the top level, that it seems that top professionals are perhaps misreading their horses too. Was there a specific moment or experience that made you realize how widespread abuse is in the equestrian industry and competition?
I don't know if there's a specific moment, but I do remember like when I started to really be like, okay, wait, this doesn't feel right. I think something's up. And it was when the very first catalyst for that was when I had my Arabian horse and I boarded him at a show barn where he was stalled for like 18 hours a day, and then he'd go out in a small paddock by himself for about 6 to 8 hours a day on average, depending on the time of year, sometimes even less than that. And he would always spook a lot and he bolted a lot under saddle, and he was just really quite a flighty horse, and I likened it to him being an Arabian. But when I moved him to a backyard barn, or like I'll use that in quotations because that's what show people would reference it as, because it was pleasure riding and like trail riders, where he was out 24/7 in a herd. Basically, overnight, I saw a change in behavior where he went from being this really spooky, bolty, flighty horse to a horse who was bomb proof and that I could do basically anything with. And it was very clear to me what the difference was, because the only change was the living situation. And I hadn't changed any of my training practices at that point. So that led me to being really curious about what I had been taught was normal, because it was this seemingly small change that completely changed his behavior without any training differences. And then from there, I started to get curious about going into equine sciences, which I had started to study like equine exercise physiology. And then I got into behavior. And then I got my rescue horse, Milo, who, when I tried to use high pressure methods on him, he would turn on me and he'd be ready to square up and fight with me if I put too much pressure on him. And I'd never had a horse that did that. So then that exposed to me some flaws in the system that I had been taught. And then the more I studied horse behavior, the more I started to learn about the process of which I was training through. And for me, when I learned about operant conditioning and how negative reinforcement as a process works, where the reinforcing mechanism is the relief of an aversive, I couldn't answer the question, what incentive does my horse have to enjoy our training together if that's the only reinforcer I'm using? Because for myself, if someone was only reinforcing me by relief of something that I found to be aversive, I know that I don't feel good about what I'm being asked to do in those situations if that is the only reinforcing factor that that person uses. It makes me feel kind of hesitant to want to be around people like that if it's just negative reinforcement or punishment. And so since I couldn't answer that, and honestly, I still can't, I started using more and more rewards-based methods and learning how to use them more efficiently. And then I saw the difference that it made in my horses. And then from there, I started to look at the competitive show industry through a critical lens and look at the equipment that was being used, the types of bits that are on the market, how the mechanics of them work, and really start to dive into that. And then the more I learned, the more I was beginning to realize how much of this is achieved through really extensive coercive force. But we paint it as if the horses and the riders are partners. But if you actually break it down and look at it in practice and what mechanisms people are using to achieve what they're doing, a lot of it is just coercion. Because if it was a true partnership, there wouldn't be any need for harsh bits. There wouldn't be any need for more and more excessive equipment to basically amplify the effect of the rider's hands or the rider's aids in general to create a response. And it really just lifted the veil from the show world for me where I couldn't unsee what I was seeing. And then when I started to study horse behavior more, I started to recognize that I couldn't go to shows anymore without seeing how high the state of stress was for the average horse at the show. And this isn't to call out every rider ever that shows because there are people who do it in an ethical manner, but the act of showing and how we've set up the structure of the competitive horse industry is stressful at its core. And unless we shift the way that we're doing things, it's very hard to create an atmosphere for horses that isn't incredibly stressful. So after that, I just started to really come to terms with the fact that what I had been taught to believe wasn't how things actually were. And then when I started speaking out about these things, it became even more clear to me how deep the conditioning goes because I would share things where, like, I would try to pick photos of horses that are just so clearly stark in how stressed the horse is, or where you can see things like the rider is pulling hard enough on the mouth to create a blue tongue, or the horse is bleeding. And even with photos showing that severity of discomfort, people would defend them. And it just made me realize that abuse really is so widespread and accepted in the horse industry that depending on who the abuser is, they'll be defended basically no matter what. So once someone is an elite level rider, they can get away with a lot more than, let's say, an amateur or a junior rider could, simply because of their name. People are willing to defend them. And that to me exposed like a lot of corruption in the industry because I recognized the standard that I was often held to on social media before I became a professional, and also the standard I still am held to, where people will nitpick little things in my horsemanship that are not as damaging as some of the things that I talk about with elite level riders. But because I'm not as internationally renowned and don't have the competitive show record of those people, it's not as accepted, or my mistakes will be highlighted even if I've owned them and held myself accountable for them in the past. But then in the same breath, the people doing that will be defending an elite level rider like Andreas Helgstrand simply because of who he is. And that level of conditioning and corruption is so ingrained that you can't really get around the fact that it enables such a high level of abuse, because if it's happening at the pinnacle of the sport, it trickles down to everything, because those are the riders that we're looking to for guidance and as role models.
Yeah, absolutely. And many people look up to these top riders and hold them on a pedestal. But how do we hold them accountable without being dismissed as ignorant or inexperienced?
I think it's important to realize that no matter who your idol is, even if it's someone that's in the welfare sector, like they are just a person. Like we're all just people and people aren't infallible. Like all of us make mistakes. And I think that a really green flag in a trainer is someone who will admit that they make mistakes and can own up to it. But if there's this idea that once you hit a certain level that you're untouchable and that no one can speak out about those people until you're at that level, that entire idea is just to protect people at that top of the sport. I think what I would encourage people to consider is that while elite level riders are knowledgeable about how to ride at that level. They're knowledgeable as riders. They can pilot a horse around a Grand Prix dressage test or over a meter 60 jump course. They're not welfare and behavioral experts. So they are not who people should go to for guidance on things pertaining to behavior and welfare. And as it stands, equine scientists and equine behaviorists and the people who are leading the charge in those fields have a lot of concern about the ethics of upper level horse sport and horse competition in general. And they have studies that are there to eliminate bias and really investigate the horse's feelings without looking at it through the emotional lens of the rider and trying to protect the rider's feelings. And those are who we should be looking to as guides for ethics when it comes to whether or not is the sport ethical, what can we do to make it better for the horses, not the riders, because none of those riders at the top of the sport have any relevant behavioral education. And that's not me discounting their experience as a rider, but it's pointing out the fact that if all of your experience is surrounding getting to the top of the competitive show industry, it's actually in their best interest to have less of a behavioral and welfare knowledge, because if they did study those things, it would be a lot less comfortable to justify a lot of the things that they do and see to get to the top. So who we should go to for the guidance on ethics are the people who are studying horse welfare and horse behavior and equine sciences, not the people who are participating at the pinnacle of the sport, because they are the ones who could tell you how to do a dressage test or a jump course and how to actually ride it without consideration for how the horse might experience those things, but they're not the ethical professionals.
Social media gives people a platform to expose this kind of abuse, but some people say it also breeds cancel culture. Where do you think the line is?
I think that like the line is that accountability is important. How someone responds to accountability and like being held accountable and how they respond to their mistakes being exposed, I think is the biggest thing. We need to leave room for someone to improve and grow. And if they show that they're taking change seriously and putting the work in, then there's no reason to hold someone to their past self. If they don't show that they're trying to progress and change, or if they downplay what they're doing and there is like a lack of care to actually improve, then that's a little different. I do think in the horse world that people most often mistake being held accountable as cancel culture. If someone is caught on video whipping the crap out of their horse repeatedly and they're already an Olympic level rider who has been around horses for years, they know better. They still chose to do that while they were being filmed in a lesson. And it's a huge mistake to make. How they respond to that mistake, I think, will speak for who they are going forward. But it isn't cancel culture for that person to lose sponsors and be held accountable for that act, because that is a pretty big mistake. And it's the type of thing that even at lower levels would be really impactful and would impact your ability to participate in the horse world. But to be quite honest, like none of these upper level pros who have had these big abuse allegations have ever actually been canceled. Andy Kocher got a 10-year ban from competition, but he's still actively training. Charlotte Dujardin still actively training. Andreas Helgstrand still actively training. Even some horse people who are not necessarily at the pinnacle of the sport, but who have been caught abusing horses and like to the point where they've killed horses are still actively training and getting clients. So they've never actually been canceled because their ability to continue participating in the sport and doing training and making a living was never actually impacted in a big way, because people still go to them as a client and they never actually lost access to horses. They did, however, have what their behavior exposed. And I think the biggest thing is that if someone doesn't resonate with their behavior that was exposed in a video or a photo, that then you separate yourself from that action and you work to do better and show that you're not that person. And once you do that, then it's like you're leaving your mistakes in the past and people don't really have any leg to stand on to continue coming at you for something that you're no longer doing. But I think the problem is that a lot of the riders who are exposed resonate so much with their behavior that they have no intention of changing and they're only looking to do damage control. So then people feel more attacked and targeted from that regard because they are being held to who they are and what they are going to continue doing, and they don't like that. So I would say like the line is to stay on topic, to make sure you're holding people accountable for behavior that they have a pattern of doing and that they've been exposed for, but also to leave the door open for them to do better. If they actually take accountability and say, I really screwed up, I was horrible to my horse, I never intend to do that, and then they actually show that they're going out of their way to do better, then that's great. Other than that, I think that holding upper level riders more accountable than you would people who are less experienced and who are less role models is fair because they should be held to a higher standard while they might not have like chosen the spotlight per se, because sometimes you get swept into it just by talent and opportunities. Their choice to continue competing at the upper levels is a choice to be in the media more and to be more watched and witnessed by people. And that's something that will come with potentially getting outed for engaging in abusive practices if you're caught on film doing them. And that's just part of the process. And the easiest way to avoid that happening is to not do sketchy stuff with your horses.
Yeah, absolutely. And what frustrates me so much is you see this abuse being exposed, but then in a few weeks, it's kind of all blowed over and no one's talking about it anymore. And then a year later, they're competing and it's like nothing happened. And that should be career damaging for someone, right? Like it should be career ending. And I think it should be an opportunity for them to change, like you have mentioned. And I think what a wonderful opportunity for them to inspire others and educate others and like kind of turn things around for themselves and set an example and be like, okay, I admit this is wrong. I'm looking at other avenues. Like I want to do better. These are the things I'm now exploring. But I honestly, I don't know. I don't really have much hope for that happening, especially since, you know, their area of interest is like competition, usually competition, top level dressage and things like that. Why do you think these abusive training methods are still so prevalent in competition at all levels, but especially at the top, even though it's being exposed?
I think that it's because a lot of people who are at that level take shortcuts in order to produce horses as quickly as they do and have as many horses as they do. And they've been taught to do that by people before them, like other like the previous greats, the trainers of the past. And it's kind of a never-ending cycle because in order to do things differently, they would have to take themselves out of competition for a time to learn how to do things differently. And a lot of people don't want to put in the legwork to do that because it wouldn't be instantly gratifying. And I think that's one of the biggest things in the horse world as a whole, even outside of elite competition, is that so many equestrians are just seeking instant gratification where they want to be jumping a certain height right now. They want their horse to be able to do something right now. But horses are like people where you need to build physical fitness and ability, or where you might not even have the physical ability to do something. And then we try to manufacture it with new equipment or a different training program, and it's not fair to them. But I think one of the biggest things is that it's way more lucrative as a trainer and rider to produce horses quickly and to do impressive things with them as quickly as possible. You get paid more, you get more views on social media when you're jumping higher. So there's a lot of different rewarding components that keep people in that mindset. And then also you have the component that once you're at the top of the sport, so many people around you are all doing these same sketchy things that if you're not like them, you don't typically want to speak out about it because it'll make you a target from those people. But then if you are like them, you have all of these other people around you doing the same things, and it can make it feel normal. And then if you think it's normal, then you don't see as much of a problem with it and you become desensitized to it. And then we also have a huge problem with corruption because Andreas Helgstrand is a great example of this. He owns the Wellington Equestrian like festival showground. He owns Kingsland Equestrian. He owns Chronicle of the Horse. He where he owns like Patrick Kittle's training facility. He works with Ludger Beerbaum. He
He owns
is
the horse
so in
industry.
the yeah, like he literally runs the industry. So then we watched him come back after his ban, right? And he just starts winning and having top three placings in everything. If you look at also the placings on a lot of the riders who are winning, they are in his training program or on his horses. And he's also a billionaire. So we have to look at that component too, where I think a lot of people who could talk and out more problems are staying silent out of fear of him. And I do get that to an extent because if you are part of that elite group and you do speak out, you're going to be one of the first targets. Whereas someone like myself is viewed as more of a little guy compared to those big, elite, wealthy people. And I'm not going to be as much of a target for someone like him to want to shut down. But if you blow the whistle when you're amongst that crowd of people, it could be career ending. So then I think there's a lot of fear involved too, where people don't want to speak out because they're really afraid of it coming back to bite them.
If you could wave a magic wand and fix everything in the horse world, I know that's unrealistic, but let's just imagine for a moment, what would it look like? Paint us a picture of the ultimate situation if there were no limits at all.
I think that it would prioritize things like, for example, in the dressage ring, you're not allowed to talk to your horse. I personally think that verbal aids over physical ones would be kinder to the horse because then they're not always having to deal with pressure. And if you can get your horse to do something verbally, that's great. Also, allowing for things like rewarding your horse in competition, prioritizing things like allowing horses to be close to other horses so that they have better turnout facilities or at least better stall facilities so that they can get up and down more, normalizing things like online competition so that horses aren't being moved around so much internationally to travel because travel in itself is really, really stressful. Making way harsher equipment regulations because there's a lot of bits and equipment that do not need to be used and cannot be used ethically, or even if they can be, the motivation behind selecting them in the first place is largely influenced by trying to suppress behavior, and we shouldn't be allowing for that. Like, ideally, the best of the best people at the top of the sport should need the least amount of equipment and should have the quietest, most relaxed, and well-adjusted horses, not horses that are quote unquote quirky and having all these problem behaviors. They should be relaxed. And we should be able to see horses that you don't need so much equipment to handle, that they don't need to have a nose chain or a lip chain to be walked around the competition because they're well adjusted and calm. So in a perfect world, competition in theory would be a lot more boring to watch because the horses wouldn't be as flighty and excitable and they wouldn't be having as much bucking and rearing or bolting, etc. We also might need to lower the amount of physical demand that we have on horses. So like the height of the jumps, how demanding things are, and change that. Also, dressage would go back to a more classical route where it's not basically a circus performance because honestly, the dressage horses have just started to look more and more like saddle seat horses and it's not real dressage anymore. And it's really unfortunate for riders that do put the work in to properly school their horses because they aren't the ones that are winning and it's not fair. I also think that improving accessibility in horse sports so that there is less of like less of a financial exclusion so that people from all walks of life actually have the opportunity to get there and giving more scholarships and whatnot would change the paradigm because you get more opinions from different areas in life rather than just having it be this really insular community that's mostly very, very privileged people.
I'm actually surprised that you mentioned those changes to competition rather than completely kind of banning competition in an ideal world. Do you think that horses can enjoy competition, and do you think horses can enjoy being ridden?
I do think it is possible to have them do that, but I think that it is unlikely that the horse world is going to get to that point before we're shut down by outside entities because the abuse in the sport is really plainly seen by people that haven't been conditioned to think that it's normal. So all these people outside of the horse world see the problems at face value, usually very easily and more insightfully than a lot of horse people do. So I think it's possible, but I think that there's so much stubbornness and refusal to change. And people also mock positive reinforcement and rewards-based training and the entire idea of handling horses without hitting them and showing them who's boss and like there's so much commitment to this dominance-based perspective that I can't see us heading in that direction because I think people would fight it tooth and nail, and that it would require a lot of inner growth on a lot of people in a way that is not super likely to happen because it's so entrenched, like beyond just their association with horses. It requires you to self-reflect on such a personal level why you're so easily angered or frustrated or wanting to do these things. And it goes a lot deeper than horse training. And I think a lot of people really aren't ready to look at themselves in that intimate of a light and reflect the degree that they need to. So I think in a perfect world that it could be, and that we could make competition rewarding and ethical, and that horses could choose to opt into riding if we made it a pleasant experience for them and changed a lot of things. But I think based off of the horse world as a profit-driven industry and with so much status and privilege involved, that it's unlikely to happen, because even something like, for example, banning the young horse classes and prioritizing having like longer starting processes for getting horses prepped to be under saddle. A lot of people don't want to do that and aren't ready to learn how and wouldn't want to. So there'd just be a lot of resistance. So I would like to see it, but I personally don't see it happening. And I've kind of come to terms with the fact that the competition industry, with how it's heading now, is just doomed to collapse, because I think by the time those in charge are backed into enough of a corner that they feel like they need to make welfare changes, that it's already going to be too late, and people aren't going to believe that horse people are actually capable of change at the capacity that it's needed, because we're already like several decades behind from a welfare perspective, and people in other animal industries that are more accepting of modern science and have better ethics, like in dog training. Like obviously there's still bad dog trainers, but there's a higher standard by far than there is in the horse world, and a greater acceptance of behavioral science. We are so far behind even that I just can't see it happening, because the information is consistently outpacing where the horse world is.
So realistically, like if you did have the power to overhaul the industry, but it's not a perfect world, what are the first three things you'd change to make a difference?
I would change management for horses first, where like I full on believe it just shouldn't even be legal to have horses where they're spending more time in a 12 by 12 stall than they do in a larger space.
Yeah.
And I know that like suburban and like more urban areas, that's definitely a challenge. But like as far as I see it, it's a challenge that we need to figure out for the horses, rather than making the horses just cope with inadequate treatment so that we can enjoy them, because we're not entitled to having horses. And I've started to view it through the lens of, it's like I could decide that I want to have an exotic pet tomorrow, but if I don't have the housing for one, it's not fair for me to get one simply because I want one. And it's the same with a horse. You can love horses and you can want to have a horse with all of your heart, but if you cannot provide their most crucial needs and aren't willing to make the sacrifices to ensure that they have them, then it really isn't fair to the horse to have to live in a neglectful state just so that the person can enjoy it. And that's just the reality of the situation, as hard as it is for people to hear that. So the management thing would be a huge one, is that all horses need friends, freedom, forage. And if we provided those things and they were properly, those needs were met, a lot of the issues that people then try to justify under saddle wouldn't need to exist. The other things I would change would be way more equipment rules. I don't think that any type of abrasive mouthpiece needs to ever exist on a bit. I think that we should be throwing out gags and curb bits, and it should be a situation where people are learning how to train with the most basic snaffles if they're going to ride in a bit, and that bit list should also be legal across disciplines. And that when we're looking at the mouthpieces of bits, we should be trying to make them as anatomically formed as possible and dental grade materials rather than metal, because I do think from like my own perspective as a person, like having metal tools put into your mouth, even when you're at the dentist consensually, sucks. I can't imagine how much it would suck with the nose band strapping your mouth shut, and with someone pulling and you not being able to say, hey, that's too much. Can you stop? So there's a lot of things that we've normalized that if you look deeply into them, there's a lot of need for change. The studies on bits in general are really concerning in terms of the amount of oral damage that is being seen in horses. And those studies are incredibly underfunded and also undervalued, because people don't want to have to come to terms with that, because they want to be able to continue using bits without that consideration. But the studies we do have overwhelmingly show that there's ethical implications with bits. So if we're going to use them, there needs to be a lot more stringent regulations. And then the last thing would be like at the actual competitions is if we're going to take horses to competition grounds, it would be the same thing with the management where there needs to be better management protocols so that it's less stressful for the horses and also better regulations across the board where riders are being excused from the arena way more often if their horses are struggling and like normalizing the idea where if your horse is having a really hard time and it's just not going well that you just leave and having that just be commonplace. And if the regulation boards would do a better job with just excusing riders and setting that as an example, it'd be easier for riders to start to make that choice for themselves rather than pushing their horses through so much trauma and stress. So I think the equipment, the management, and then making it more incentivized to reward horses who are calm and displaying relaxed behaviors and low conflict behaviors, if any, rather than just ignoring the presence of conflict and stress behaviors and having the marks not reflect that the horse is stressed.
It's unfortunate that many of the riders who I personally look up to, who seem to do dressage in a way that the horse is happy and light and willing and calm and relaxed, they're not competing, probably because they aren't a fan of that kind of environment anyway. Is there anyone at the top or any riders that you think are riding, competing, doing dressage in a way that is ethical?
At the top of the sport, honestly, not really, because it's so like I can't think of any that come to my mind where I'm like their horse is consistently not showing conflict behaviors. There is a rider that like she's not competing internationally at the top of the sport yet, but she is schooling upper level dressage. Alexis Martin Veg she's a very nice rider and her horses are really quiet and she rides in a double bridle without the noseband. And it's a much more pleasant thing to watch. But unfortunately, riders like that aren't the ones that we're seeing in the limelight internationally and like at the Olympics and whatnot. So I do think that there are a lot of barriers that prevent people such as herself from getting there in the same way. And there's more riders that I see that are at like a lower level and that are less known than our elite level riders that are riding in a nice way than the people that I see at the very pinnacle of the sport. I would say like for upper level like show jumpers, Peter Fredrickson is a lot more pleasant to watch than a lot of riders. His horses also all go out in herds and they're barefoot. And he like his management is a lot better. And there's riders that are normalizing better management, but there still leaves a lot to be desired in terms of like how quiet the horses are. However, Peter Fredrickson's horses, if you watch them during like award ceremonies and stuff, there's a notable difference between his horses and other horses who do not have the same level of access to species specific needs.
Okay, well, I'll have to check those two riders out. It's always nice to find riders who are inspiring and kind of leading the way in terms of how we should be approaching horse sports in a more ethical way. Outside of horse sports and competition, what practices in the horsemanship or liberty type niches do you consider unethical or even abusive? Like, how can someone differentiate between ethical and unethical practices, even within an industry or a sub industry that kind of talks about partnership and perhaps paints a picture that isn't actually going on?
I would look at the horse's expression because a lot of like you can find liberty horses that have clearly been worked in a way where they haven't had freedom and where there has been force used, and then they take away the equipment after.
Mm-hmm.
And you can see that's a lot more manufactured. So you tend to see like a lot more pinned ears and like tight faces with like a peak above the eye and like clenched jaws, more tail swishing and just general frustration. And that can be an indicator that it wasn't taught in an ethical manner. Also, like even within the rewards-based community, if someone withholds food and makes their horse hungry before they're going to train, so that they're more desperate to have food, that can be really coercive, even if you're using rewards-based methods.
Mm-hmm.
I would also look at like how they teach basics like tying horses and whatnot, because there are a lot of trainers who on paper will have more at like horsemanship based methods, but then will do things like hard tying horses as a means of training them to stand quietly, and they'll just have them fight back until they give up. And that's super dangerous. And trainers that are actually involved in the process of training their horses won't do that, because I call that spectating, because you're just tying a knot and watching your horse struggle and like having a pole do the work for you. So basically, if you can have an inanimate object stand in for you, you might need to reflect on like how involved you are in the horse's training because it shouldn't be like that. So I would look for signs of shutdown and like conflict behaviors that indicate stress and just be more mindful of that. And also see whether or not like in practice, like what they're saying, if it actually is reflected in the work that they do. Are their horses happy to see them? Are they easy to catch? How are they to be tacked? If you have the opportunity to see these things, that can be really telling too, no matter how good they can make things look on paper or on video. Um, it is less tack and softer equipment isn't necessarily a sign that someone has achieved something more ethically because you're only seeing the end result. So then you have to look at the horse and see what the horse tells you.
Earlier, you touched on operant conditioning, and that's been a big discussion on the podcast at the moment in terms of looking at negative reinforcement, positive reinforcement, and combined reinforcement. Obviously, you use a lot of rewards-based training, but do you think that like a more kind of pure negative reinforcement approach has or can be ethical or can be used ethically?
I do. Like I think that I think that non-escalating negative reinforcement would be the way to go because if you need to escalate the intensity of the pressure to achieve a response, that's a really slippery slope to the point where it can get escalated to the point where it's like punishing to the horse. So like as soft of a pressure as possible. But with that said, I would still encourage people to be open to rewards-based methods because no matter how soft the negative reinforcement is, you have to consider that in order for it to function as a reinforcer, it does still have to be aversive.
Mm-hmm.
There's this notion amongst some horse people that negative reinforcement is possible without being aversive, but if the pressure isn't aversive, it would be a neutral pressure that the horse would just ignore and you wouldn't get the behavioral change. So if you're using it, it does still have to be aversive, which can range from mildly annoying or slightly irritating to painful and scary for the horse. So there's a huge range, but it needs to be aversive in order to function. So I'd still encourage people to at least like include some level of rewards in their training to make there be more of a positive incentive for the horse. However, like I would be thrilled to see people just using less aggressive pressure and being more patient and not just trying to chase their horses into doing certain behaviors by increasing the amount of pressure, because that would be a huge change in ethics.
You've called out a lot of unethical practices on social media. What kind of backlash have you faced and how do you handle it?
I get a lot of like just rude comments or condescending comments, and I have noticed that there is a huge element of sexism and ageism involved in that. To the point where like when I get a comment from a man that is actually respectful to me, whether they agree or not, it's like a pleasant surprise because there are a lot of people who are men that just degrade me for being a woman and will say things that I need to get a new job, I need to find a man to pay for my life, otherwise I'm not going to make it, or that I should just be a stripper. I've had people say
Wow.
stuff like that. And that has been telling because I've been like, this is stuff that they would not say if I was a male trainer. But in terms of pressure, I'd say that what people try to pressure me into silence by doing is a lot of times random people will threaten lawsuits and they'll be like, oh, this is defamation. You're going to get a lawsuit. But they don't know what defamation is. And they don't know that I actually am relatively well versed on legalities and that you can't scare me by making up a fake threat. Or they'll do things like I got review bombed on my business page by a bunch of people who were defending the barrel racer
Oh,
Fallon
yes, I
Taylor.
saw that. Yeah.
Yeah, where they just gave me negative reviews and
So
that's an
unfair.
attempt. Yeah, it was frustrating, but like luckily for me, like since I've built a platform, like people like balanced out those reviews by giving me good ones. But if I was a smaller business and like a smaller trainer, it could be really negatively impactful to my business. So it's still really annoying that people do that. And when they do, I try to make an example of them because if I was a smaller person and easier to kick around like that, then they would get away with it. So I try to make it so that people can't get away with that. And I want to make light of how much misogyny I experience and how people speak to me because a lot of time it's very rare that someone who doesn't like what I'm saying is actually attacking my argument and coming back with insightful commentary and debate that focuses on what I'm actually saying, like the content of what I'm saying. It's usually personal attacks, logical fallacies, and them trying to push me around by pressuring me. And I really don't like that because it's bullying. And ironically, it's not dissimilar to the tactics that they're defending using on horses, that they're trying to bully me into a certain response by increasing pressure and essentially trying to frighten me into compliance. And when it doesn't work, they just continue escalating and escalating until they sometimes they give up. Other times there's people who I've had on my page that have dedicated years to commenting and still routinely come on there. Um, but what I try to tell people is that like when you get people like that are that triggered and upset, it is a sign that like something that you have said has resonated with them enough that they're very uncomfortable and they're trying to alleviate that discomfort by basically attacking you. If they were really confident in their perspectives and what they did, and they truly thought that I was a nobody, they wouldn't dedicate so much time to trying to comment on my page. So I try to ignore it. I turn off notifications on posts when I need to. I have like a really good support group of people that whose opinions I respect and who I trust to give me meaningful advice and be honest with me. And I'm pretty comfortable with the fact that if new information comes about that shows that I've been wrong, I know I can accept it because I have already done that before. So I'm comfortable with where I am currently with following research and learning and continuing to grow as a person and a horse person. And that makes it a lot easier because I don't have the same amount of attachment to the way that I do things and how other people perceive it as what I used to. So when people freak out on me and get mad about what I post, it doesn't impact me how it used to.
And on that note, have you ever engaged in a discussion in the comments where the person has changed your mind on an issue? Or like, have you usually already done your research and you're kind of solid in where you stand on that post?
With most of the stuff with horses, at least in recent years, I'm usually pretty solid on what I've said because most of the time people don't come with conflicting information that has any type of credible source. So basically, it's just like, I feel this way about the issue, so you should believe me. And I'm not inclined to just go off of like an emotional argument like that. However, like there has been things that people have said that have made me think a little bit deeper. Like with the Charlotte Dujardin case, a bunch of people pointed out that they felt that she was being used as an example and more attacked because she's a woman, and was more convenient. They felt that the heat she was getting was more severe than what Helgstrand got, and they didn't think that that was fair. And I would agree with that. I don't think that it makes what she did justifiable, and like neither did the people who are saying that. But I do think that there's a component where she was treated differently because she's a woman, and where there was less defense of her, despite the fact that like what she did was a lot less bad than what Helgstrand got suspended for. And it's also interesting that they both got 1 year suspensions when he had far more cases of abuse than just a singular video.
I actually hadn't had heard anyone speak about that discrepancy between how they were both treated as a result of the abuse. But yeah, that's really unfair. But again, no excuses for the behavior. What would you say is the most frustrating or disheartening argument you hear from defenders of unethical training?
I find it really hard to hear, like, if the horse didn't want to, they wouldn't do it, or that, like, horses at this level, you can't make them do stuff, because basically with that argument, you can justify any means of getting a result simply just by if the horse does it, that they obviously wanted to do it, which we know isn't true, but that line of thinking justifies so much abuse because they're just looking at the results and going, oh, well, if they didn't want to, they wouldn't. These are big animals. We couldn't possibly force them to do these things. And it's just such an entrenched mindset in so many different equestrian communities. And I see it used to defend some of the most heinous forms of abuse. And it's really hard to hear.
And what keeps you motivated to keep pushing for change even when the industry in general resists?
I know that if I don't say anything, it's the same result as if I say something and nothing happens. So I might as well at least try because at the very least, it's like if there's other people who have felt uncomfortable with the way that things are and who've questioned things but have had their concerns completely disregarded by their trainers or who have been made to feel like they are alone in feeling that way. By sharing how I'm feeling, it gives those people solidarity and can make them feel more comfortable in their stance. And that's
Yeah.
basically the most important thing to me is that if I speak out, it gives other people the confidence to do the same, even if it's only a handful of people. So it builds community. It makes people feel safer in sharing their story. And it's talking about a lot of the problems in the horse industry that I honestly think resemble a lot of the problems we see in like society as it's at its core, because a lot of it just comes down to there being a lack of empathy and a lack of desire to understand the struggles of other people and horses, and also profit driven motives. So it's important for me to talk about it. And it's also cathartic because it's the way that I can kind of give back to the community and help to rectify some of the mistakes that I've made in the past. Is just by doing what I can to voice things. And I have seen like the pressure from social media, I do think is responsible for some of the policy changes we have seen lately. Such as spurs not no longer being compulsory at the upper levels of dressage, and the Danish Federation of Dressage has made it so that snaffles are legal up to Grand Prix, and they're making bitless legal, and like so these are all really nice positive changes, and I think that the pressure that we've seen from social media for sure has contributed to that.
Yeah, yeah. And that was going to be one of my questions as well. Do you think that social media is making it more possible to see positive change in the horse world? But I think you've answered that. What would you say is the biggest misconception people have about your advocacy work?
I think a lot of people think that I do it because I think I'm better than everyone. And like, no, the reason why I talk about it is because I know that I'm not. And like, I know that I used to do similar things. And if I'm capable of changing, then anyone is. And if I didn't think other people were capable of changing, there'd be no point in advocating. It's not about being better. It's about looking out for the horse and speaking out for the horse who's voiceless. It's not a competition. I don't want to be better than people. I wish that the horses were just happier. And I don't want it to be like where we're looking at it through that competitive lens where the only reason someone might speak out on welfare is just to one up someone, because that's not what it's about. Or a lot of people will claim that it's because I'm jealous of the people at the top of the sport. And I cannot stress this enough. If I became a millionaire tomorrow, like I wouldn't have an immediate desire to compete. I find it really stressful to be at shows. It might be something that I dabble in occasionally, but I don't want to be a competitive show rider. I don't want to travel the world with horses competing. It honestly sounds awful to me. That's not what I want at all. It's coming from a place of concern for the horse and just like a really acute feeling of needing to be their voice, because I know in times of my past where I felt voiceless and where I felt I haven't had people there to advocate for me. And it's a really crappy state to be in, much less when everything that you do in life is controlled by someone else in the way that it would be for horses. So I feel a duty to speak out for them, and I'm more committed to the horse and their perspective and how horses view me than how other people do, because horses don't lie. They don't have any motives. They don't have any ulterior motives they're trying to hide from you. They're not dishonest. They don't operate the way a lot of people do. So I think that they're just these really gentle and docile creatures that we should protect because we take for granted how kind they are.
And on top of your advocacy work, you're also a trainer and a qualified behavior consultant. What are your own personal goals when it comes to your own horses? What do you like to do with your own horses and your clients?
So for clients, a lot of the horses I work with have behavioral problems. So what we work with kind of depends on the horse's own personal struggles. I took a step back from training clients for a while because I found that I was constantly being put in situations where I would be being pressured to do things that I didn't feel comfortable with or that weren't ethical, or the horse was struggling with stuff related to management. And if the owner wasn't open to changing the management situation, I just kind of feel like I'm scamming people by taking their money, because the entire cause of their problems is related to the horse's living situation. And while it's possible to help horses learn how to cope better with that, it's not going to bring the change that the owner's looking for until they deal with the underlying cause of the behavior. So now when I take clients, I just try to make sure that they're really aligned in being open to listening and doing things differently. And then that's been a lot nicer for me where it's been less stressful because before it was really stressful if I felt like in order to make a living, I had to sell out on my morals a little bit. As for my own horses, right now, like I moved recently, so we've kind of just been getting settled in. And then all last summer, I was packing for a move, so they haven't really been doing very much. But this year, I want to do more trail riding, and just kind of get out and see the beautiful landscapes where I live on horseback and start getting them more into work and maybe do a little bit more jumping with Banksy and whatnot. But honestly, I don't really create hard plans for my horses anymore because so much stuff has happened with my own life and theirs, and just setbacks or things like moves that has added to the stress. So I'm kind of just open to the idea of seeing how time goes and what they're ready for and like what I'm ready for and doing that. But I've been doing a lot of stuff trying to like better their living situation and offer like lots of enrichment, and practicing stuff like cooperative care. So like trimming them and doing stuff like that without them always needing to be tied, and working with the Mustangs. So like for this year, I want to do more work with my Mustangs now that we're somewhere where we have more access to training areas because I didn't have an arena before and it made it really difficult to separate horses for training, especially during the wet season when the ground would all be wet and muddy. Um, so now I have more access to stuff like that. And now as we head into the brighter days, I'll have more ability to do those things. But yeah, mainly my big priority is just I really want to take my horses camping and go trail riding and stuff. And because I've really gotten into hiking, and that's kind of the best of both worlds is to be able to do stuff like that on horseback, and then see where it goes. Because for competition stuff, I was initially planning on showing more than what I have been, and I have kind of mixed feelings about that. So I have to kind of see how things progress and how I'm feeling, um, and go from there.
Camping and hiking with horses sounds absolutely amazing. And I don't know if you've noticed this, but I feel that my own horses like find trail riding and exploring kind of new natural environments intrinsically rewarding. Like they seem to really enjoy it. Even if
Yes,
I'm not
for
using a
sure.
whole lot of positive reinforcement within that session, they just seem to be really into it. So it's enjoyable for both of us.
I agree with that. I think arena work bores a lot of horses, and you have to use a way higher rate of reinforcement to make it more enjoyable. So
Yes.
the trails are fun because it's more engaging.
One of the questions that we always ask everyone on the Horsemanship Breakthroughs podcast is, do you have any favorite horse books or resources? Because we've got a list of all the books and resources that people have recommended that I would love your recommendations for. And can you also let us know what you're currently interested in and studying?
Yep. So I really like Language and Calming Signals of Horses by Rachel Drasma is a really good book because it goes in depth on different behaviors of horses, that she's studied, and it's a really good guide for people interested in getting into behavior. The Equitation Science textbook is also really good. It has a lot of stuff on positive and negative reinforcement and all types of operant conditioning and horse behavior. And then there's also the Horse Behavior veterinary textbook, that Dr. Paul McGreevy helps write, and it's full of like studies and citations on all things horse behavior. That one's a lot more in depth since it is a textbook that's meant for like people in the veterinary behavior industry to learn from. So it's heavier reading, but it's really, really good. And I really enjoyed that one because it's very good just to use as a reference because you can kind of like bookmark different pages and whatnot. I also have really gotten into just reading more stuff on like psychology and spirituality. So I'm a big fan of Dr. Gabor Mate, who is a Canadian doctor who has done a lot of kind of new wave science stuff on the science behind trauma and how chronic trauma and anxiety and whatnot influences physical health and studies on that. So I really liked his book, The Myth of Normal, and it's essentially talking about how a lot of the problems that people experience in society health-wise are directly influenced by the stress that the way we live imposes on us, and how he's had clients that have been able to heal autoimmune disorders and types of cancers by changing those things. And it's fascinating to me. So I've been learning a lot about how much more power we have over the way we think and like how we feel and how like the mind body connection. And that's been really fascinating to me. That's a huge special interest of mine. I really liked his book. There's also a book called The Gift of Fear that is talking about intuition and how humans as a species have kind of been taught to try to logic their way through their intuition and ignore it. And that intuition is like a biological skill set where our subconscious is trying to keep us safe. And that if we learned how to operate more intuitively, that it can help avoid a lot of safety issues. And the guy who wrote it was like a FBI behavior profiler. So he's studied a lot of psychology stuff, and there's a lot of different case studies and whatnot that he has in that book that are fascinating.
Wow, thank you for those recommendations. I'm particularly excited to read the last two that you mentioned. They sound really interesting. I have got the other three, I'm pretty sure, on the list already. And I do know that I think the Equitation Science textbook was authored by Paul McGreevy as well. I'm not sure if it was in collaboration with Andrew McLean, but
I think it was in collaboration with him.
Yeah. And I know that Andrew McLean has some new books out as well. I think it's called Modern Horsemanship or something like that. I'll have to look into that. But have you read that one yet? Or?
No, not yet, but I'll definitely look into it because I haven't read any recently.
And I was thinking as well, I feel like, I don't know if you already have, but you should write a book.
I have actually. I was going to mention that. I have one that's already published called The Other Side of Horsemanship, which for anyone who's going through like a transitional stage in their horsemanship, it's basically about like how I grew up being taught to ride and traumas outside of riding that I think influenced how kind of predisposed to punishment I was by what my trainers taught me. So it's all about that, and then it goes into some behavioral stuff at the end too, and it's called The Other Side of Horsemanship. And then I have another one on the way. The name is pending right now. I don't think I can say what it's called, but it'll be released in late winter of 2025 or early 2026. And that one's going to be a lot more heavy on talking about the use of horses historically and how it's influenced the way that we train them and handle them.
Wow, that's really exciting. I will be sure to add that to the list as well when you have a title for it and when it's released. And I'll add your current book as well. Now, everyone knows you for your advocacy work, but you also offer some things online where people can learn from you. Can you tell us more about where people can find out how they can do that?
Yeah, for sure. So I have a Patreon where I post behind the scenes stuff and tutorials and do monthly Q&As, and you can subscribe to that for as little as $1 a month and participate in the Q&As and get behind the scenes access for tutorials and whatnot. It's like $15 a month to subscribe to that. And there's a tutorial library of like over 80 videos. I also have my YouTube channel that I post videos to, which is just like my name, Shelby Dennis or Milestone Equestrian. And the Patreon is like patreon.com/SDEQUUS, which is just my Instagram name. I'm on Instagram as SDEquus and then Facebook as Milestone Equestrian. And then I also have my website where I have online webinars and whatnot that can be purchased, as well as bridles and whatnot. And you can find that all at milestoneequestrian.ca.
Amazing. And I'll link all of those in the show notes too. Shelby, thank you so much for coming onto the podcast today. I know it's not easy what you do. I really admire your bravery and your contribution to the horse world for speaking up for the horse. So thank you again for coming on today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for tuning in to the Horsemanship Breakthroughs podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to follow the show so you never miss an update. I'd truly appreciate if you could leave a rating and review or share this episode on social media. It helps more listeners discover the podcast and hopefully has a positive impact on the horse world. For more resources on horsemanship and rider exercise, visit amaliadempsey.com. Thanks again for listening. Have a great day, and I'll catch you next time.